Uttam, thank you so much for inviting me to IDSA. We are somethings of, or I am, something of an outlier to the audience here. I work for a mining company called Rio Tinto. It's an Anglo-Australian mining company. My presentation today is looking to sort of focus inwards, I think. I think that may be one way of saying it. I'm going to be talking more about India and about what India could do in its internal policies towards resolving some of the resource stress that we've been talking about. As with every other panel member, there will be a mention of China. You really cannot escape it, particularly if you work for a resource company. China is extremely important to us, just like to most people in the room. Coming in as the last speaker, what I realized as I was hearing other speakers talk was that many of the issues that I'd probably like to touch upon have already been touched upon, which is fantastic. It gives me an ability to talk about other things, hopefully. My paper, which has been written with my colleague Yashika Singh, as you can see up there, it's called India's Resource Economy, Possible Choices and Probable Outcomes. And as I said, I'm going to be talking more about what India could do inwardly towards what sort of policies it could develop or it could choose to develop. So this is broadly what we are going to be talking about. First and foremost, I'd like to sort of just, put down formally what the speakers have already mentioned this, the resource intensity path and comprehending the S-curve. I think all speakers at some point or the other have spoken about economic growth and population and therefore the impact that has on how a country's resource path really moves. So I'll start with that. Then we look at, in context of that S-curve, as we call it, we look at what was China's economic growth like. Again, been touched upon by most speakers, so I'll probably be quick with that. And the impact on the resource economy. Then we can focus on India after that, which is what I'd really like to do. Where India is at the moment. Can we draw lessons from China? Are there viable lessons from China that India needs to draw upon? And lastly, we can talk about India's supply scenario and what India can do there. So that's broadly speaking what I'm going to be talking about today. Okay, I did something wrong there. All right, that's the first bit. Those lines, I don't know how well you can make them out. I can't see it very clearly this side, but hopefully it's clearer on that end. Those are basically per capita uses of aluminium of different countries placed against their per capita GDP. And you've got per capita consumption of aluminium on one side, and you've got per capita GDPs on the other side, and what you're really getting is what we usually call an S-curve. Now, S-curve, what does it really say? As countries move through different stages of development, and I'm not sure if it's Professor Sonwal who mentioned that as countries move through different stages of development, the way they use metals tends to change. In early stages of development, as countries are more agricultural, typically the use of metals is low. As they move to a more industrial level of development, the use of materials goes up and then starts to stabilize and probably drop off at very late stages of development when the services sector tends to dominate the economic composition of a country. Now, this is something that's probably been found true for most countries across the world. These facts hold true. In the past century, as countries have grown, their metal intensity has grown along with it. And we've seen that example again and again for various countries. USA, as you can see from the curve up there, if you can make out which is the US curve, it's the dotted line. It's the dotted line going towards the extreme end. Started off from a period of infrastructure development and construction. Later on, consumption patterns supported a metal-intensive growth as the consumption of white goods and cars and other such metal-intensive products continued to grow. For South Korea, that's the other line which is very interesting there. South Korea had a similar process of development, moved to and manufactured export-led industrialization, which therefore led to the growth of the country. And as you could see, the line there for South Korea is also moving very, very rapidly because of the high density of manufactured exports in its GDP. But what's most interesting, I think, is the China line. And let me just see if I can point it out. It's probably visible to those of you on that side. That's the orange line at the extreme end of that chart. It tends to follow its own path, really. And at comparably low levels of GDP, China's use of resources is much higher as compared to any of the other countries that we see on that graph. And that's really the exceptionality of China. And what China has been able to do to the resources sector, that at comparably low levels of per capita GDP, its use of per capita use of metals is much higher than what we have ever seen in the world before. You do find India there, again, probably hard to see. It's a little squiggle at the bottom, just below China. It's a red squiggle below China. And we'll talk about why India is there and what that really means as we go forth. Is China an outlier on most resource intensity paths? That's one of the questions that we hope to take up as we go forth. And that also therefore has implications. Does that have lessons for India if China was an outlier? Now, China's growth experience, again, this has been spoken about so often that I'm not sure if I should be spending too much time on this slide. So let me just see what I can pick out. One, sustained a period of phenomenal growth, over the past 30 years, 10% averaging, 3 decades of 10% GDP growth. That's phenomenal. Now, let's also remember this is happening in a country of the size of China. So, we may have seen other countries having this sort of a growth, but when you have a country the size of China developing at that pace, that's going to make a massive difference to the world economy. But also, this growth has been led by the industrial sector, and the graph on the side that you see, those are the divisions of contribution to GDP. So the blue line, the blue bit that you see in the middle, that's the contribution of the industrial sector, and it's been high and it's been sustained. Now, the industrial sector is typically more metal intensive than any other sector of the economy, as we were just talking about when I was talking about the S-curve. That goes to explain why China has been able to do what it's done to the resource economics across the world. I have another chart at the bottom, and I'll quickly touch upon that. I know it's hard to see, but I find it very interesting. This is a piece of research that we did internally within Rio Tinto, and we were trying to draw out the Kuznets curve really. And once again, we found that just the contribution of the industrial sector into China's GDP is much higher than any other country at that level of per capita GDP. So again, it is exceptional. It is exceptional. What China has been able to do is exceptional. Now, China's, as I was saying, a country of that size, when it grows that well for so long, will have a massive impact on the world economy, which is what we saw. But China's impact on the resource economy of the world was even higher than the impact on the world economy as a whole. So the commodity prices, I think Professor Sanwal, you refer to that. The commodity prices started to shoot up dramatically the moment China came onto the world stage and started buying commodities. In 2002, 2003 onwards, we saw commodity prices, which had been flatlining for the longest time, started to take off just when China entered that space. I must point out, though, that as important as China's demand was, one must also remember that it was coming on at a time when prices had been fairly benign for a period of time, and typically investments in the mining sector take place based upon expectations of prices. And because nobody had really foreseen that China would do this, for the longest time investments had not been increasing at a very fast pace in the mining sector. So when China came on, you had a period of low prices, therefore relatively low investment, therefore supply coming on, the period that the supply took to come on stream was therefore much longer, and hence the tight markets with China coming on also led to the increase in prices. Just a quick word on what happened to prices there. Moving on with China, staying with the examples, as I was talking about the Kuznets curve earlier, if you go back to understanding what is it that's driving the demand for metals as a country develops, again, issues already been touched upon. One, the composition of a country's GDP. So as you become more industrial, more metals being used. Demographics, urbanization. So these are all structural changes that take place in an economy. And as urbanization will take place and providing facilitate urban infrastructure, just the act of providing urban infrastructure, whether it's construction or other facilities, will lead to a situation where more materials are being demanded. Now, as I was saying earlier, China's impact on the resource economy has been much higher than its impact on the world economy at times. I think it hits above its weight, let's say, when it comes to the resource economy. And as you can see from that chart at the bottom, those bar graphs, what they give you is the metal, this is the world metal demand broken down by different countries as to who was demanding it. That's comparing 2000 to 2012, and the blue bit at the bottom is China's demand. And as you can see, in a period of a decade, China had started to corner a much larger 40%, 45% for iron ore, 60% of the world market is cornered by China. That's phenomenal, that level of influence in a world market. I have charts on urbanization there, which I'm not going to talk about because, as it's already been spoken about, China has followed a policy of urbanization in a very planned manner. The act of moving people from the rural sector into the urban sector by doing agricultural reforms and also by providing jobs in the industrial sector is well documented. There are these structural issues, and there are other aspects of China that are well spoken about already, so I'm not getting into that, but these have all contributed to what China has done on the resource economy front. Now, what has China therefore done to meet its massive demand? And it has, just like it's planning towards meeting its 10% growth rate, it's also done its planning towards meeting this massive demand for its minerals and metals. I must clarify, when I'm saying this, I am not demarcating between energy or base metals or ferrous metals. I am talking in a very, very general sense, but it does hold true for most of these metals and minerals. So the first thing that I think China did, which we've already alluded to, the impact it made on the resource economy of the world when China started to buy more and more in the international market. Having an export-led strategy where China was exporting large amounts of manufactured products allowed it to import massive amounts of raw materials. Now, the interesting thing is that as much as China was buying from the rest of the world, China does have resources, fairly good resources of some of the materials, such as thermal coal. 13% of the world's thermal coal resources are in China, and therefore you see a large preponderance of the energy sector, coal having a large preponderance in the energy sector because of the vast amounts of coal available. Similarly, iron ore, China has some good qualities of iron ore, or has iron ore, the quality, let's not talk about that, but it has iron ore as well. In spite of having good endowments, and in spite of being able to push up the production, domestic production from these endowments, China has gone and imported similar amounts from the rest of the world. And as you can see here, the light blue chart, which talks about the iron ore trade, that's been growing, and the one on the darker blue chart, which is China's domestic production, has been growing in tandem. So I think one of the ways to sort of look at this is that China's philosophy behind meeting its demand requirements has been buy, build, acquire. So it's bought when it needed to buy and made conditions conducive towards doing that. It built where it was necessary to build. Not only did it build its mines, but it also went ahead and built the infrastructure required to move materials from where they occur to where they were needed. And it built smelters, and it built other processing plants. It did all of that where it was needed. And lately we have seen China go on an acquisition drive as well. Now, from some of the evidence that's out there, it seems China accounted for about over 20% of the global M&A activity in 2012 in the mining sector that came from China. The amount of FDI, outward FDI from China into the mining sector has been growing at 28%, a CAGR of 28% over the last decade. Again, huge amounts of money sort of flowing out, and various pronouncements by Chinese officials continues to indicate that this will continue. This is strategic. The SOEs those are the state-owned enterprises, are they are allowed to, or they are empowered to go out and make these acquisitions, and these will continue to happen, and they'll buy at the low end of the market because they see a strategic benefit to doing so. So I think China has moved. This is how the China cycle has moved. It started to buy first, build almost simultaneously, and then it started to acquire across the world. That's really been how China has responded to its massive demand requirement. Okay, now if we were to then look at India, where does India stand? Often I think they're both Asian. They both have very high levels of population, and which is why often India is expected to replicate the China example of what China did. And in my experience, sometimes I have found that when India does not do it, India either disappoints or we sort of give up on India very quickly. I'm not quite sure if it's a fair expectation. So if you have unmet expectations, and the benchmark for those expectations was what China did, and then yes, there'll be disappointment. But there is a very real fear that you will miss what's happening in India, which is dramatic for India's sake itself. So if you're not going to be meeting expectations of what China did, there is a real fear that you'll miss out on what's happening within India, which is dramatically changing the way India functions as well. And I think that's really what we start to notice from the data itself. In China, India. India has had a fair amount of economic growth as well. Let's forget what's happening in the past 2 years. Let's just not talk about that. But prior to this period, we've had strong growth in India. This growth has not been as resource intensive as, let's say, China's performance has been, in the sense that India is not yet hitting above its weight in the global resources market. Having said that, for itself, the amount of resources that India has been using has been going up, and you can probably see that from the chart, from the number of colored lines on the graph on the right hand side. And as you can see, from about earlier for some of them, for steel a little bit earlier, but for most of the others, the total consumption of metals in India has been going up dramatically over the past few years. Now, this, as interesting as that is, in terms of how India is it's starting to use more and more resources to fuel its growth, India still does not compare well when it comes to global averages. So if you look at the chart at the bottom, you can see that the world average is about 6.5, and India is roughly at about 1.4. I think this is steel. Sorry, I haven't put that up there. So as dramatic as India's performance is for itself, it is still not comparing very high when it comes to world averages, which really to me means there is significant distance for India to travel. And if we were to look at the example and the history of other countries and the example of the S-curve, it does seem like India is about to dramatically increase its demand for resources. I have already mentioned this, but I'll just touch upon this again. India's growth has not been as resource intensive as that of China because India's growth model has been more services dependent. Now, is this peculiar to India? Is that another question that we were looking at? That is this something strange that India has done, that a country at this level of per capita income with these many people has had a services-led growth when every other country in the world has gone through a period where it went from agriculture to industry towards services? Is this a departure? Now, to an extent it is. To an extent, India is an outlier to various other countries at this level of per capita income in its share of services sector. However, it is also true that more and more developing emerging economies across the world have a much higher share of services than was originally thought. So what we believed 20, 30 years back as to what should be the share of services for a country at this level of per capita income, that itself is changing, and many of the emerging economies seem to be more services dependent earlier in their development process than was previously believed, which definitely has implications for resource intensity as well. The points at which the inflection point for resource demand takes off may be very different. Now, just to go back to the S-curve, while much of the S-curve does apply to every country, it does not seem to apply to India at the moment, because India, for its level of per capita income, is below where the S-curve would estimate it to be. And that may be also because of the nature of growth that we've seen in India, where it's been more services-led rather than industry-led. But is there something that's going to continue? And what do you think is going to happen to India? Is this how India will continue to be? It's hard to imagine that. It is really, and this is really, of course, at this moment, crystal ball gazing. And there are at any points of time multiple realities possible. However, with everything that is available as facts or as evidence to us, it does seem that India is about to change even further on its resource intensity path. And again, my fellow speakers have already alluded to some of these factors before, so I'll try and keep it brief, but I'd like to touch upon a few things that must be placed on the table here. One is the composition of GDP itself. Manufacturing sector in India has been about 15 to 16% of GDP for the past decade. It's not been able to move from there. However, manufacturing sector is also a sector which is more employment intensive than our services sector. And I think there is some recognition of this in policy circles as well, that India does need to develop its manufacturing sector if it needs GDP growth in India to be sustainable and to be able to provide jobs. So that's number one. Manufacturing sector ought to grow, should be growing. We look forward to it growing at rates much higher than what we have seen currently. Second, infrastructure. Now, infrastructure continues to be, unfortunately, a deficit in this country. We did start to make some great strides a few years back. We've seen that slowing down again. So there is much infrastructure that continues to remain to be built in the country, whether it's roads or it's rail or it's our ports. And the moment you start building more infrastructure, you're going to see a bump up in the resource intensity of the country. The third factor is urbanization, again discussed at great length in the case of China. India's urbanization is roughly 30% at the moment, and this is the current estimate, it is unlikely to see the sort of trends that we saw in China. So till about 2040, we are saying we'll have about 40% of Indians living in cities, in urban areas. So much lesser than what we have seen in China, which is already about 50%. All right. I will wrap up. Okay. I'm sorry, I've been told to wrap up. Let me see how quickly I can do this then. So, bottom line is that we are anticipating that the demand for resources in India is about to grow. And that chart on the side will show you those are not Rio Tinto estimates, those are the government of India estimates as to where exactly is the demand or the production of steel in this country likely to go over the next 10 years. Very interesting, and this does mean that a lot more iron ore would be needed. Now, what is the situation of supply in India, which is what I really wanted to talk about. So let me get to that and spend the next 5 minutes on that with them. So India is actually very well endowed. Most geologists believe this, that India was a part of what was the Gondwana land. So before the world broke up into its current constituents. So this was how it looked like. And I love doing this. So this is how the world broke up. So India came from the resource-rich Gondwana land, and all the regions that broke up from that landmass are resource-rich regions. So it stands to reason that India is resource rich as well. It's very well endowed with a large number of minerals. We have about approximately 29 billion tons of iron ore available. We have some 290 odd billion tons of thermal coal available. India is, it produces as many as 87 minerals. So India does have some minerals where it is lucky to be well endowed with them. Of course, it is import dependent on some resources, oil being one of them. Again, being discussed yesterday and today, so not touching upon that. But India's dependence on oil remains. But there are a large number of minerals which are actually well available in India, which India could tap into. Now, what's really happened with India's domestic production? Now, before we get into the production side of things, there's a science to establishing what is the amount of resources available in a country, and the science is also based upon the sort of exploration that is carried out in a country to establish the sort of resources that are available. And exploration is a science, definitely. And it is quite possible, it is just an idea being put forth, that the amount of resources that India currently knows it has, it actually may have more than that if the quality of exploration was improved. And that's, so this is what we know we currently have, which may actually be improved in any case. Now, what's happened with some of our production, to those of us who live in this country, are we probably well aware of the current situation in the mining sector where production levels for iron ore have dropped off dramatically due to various governance issues. But also for thermal coal, where India has had very good resources, India's import of thermal coal has been increasing dramatically, and that chart there tells you that we've gone from about 15 million tons in FY07, which is in 2006 approximately, to 118 million tons in 2012. This is dramatic. I don't think anybody anticipated that this is going to happen. I can tell you with complete confidence, we did not anticipate this 3 years back. 3 years back, we did not know this was going to happen, that India is going to import that many million tons of thermal coal, because India had the coal in the country. So obviously there is a policy solution that should be possible for this to resolve this situation. Of course, India's demand has grown, but India's supply has not been able to respond. And it's really a question of that. Why hasn't India's supply been able to respond to the demand growth that took place over the past few years? And that chart on the other side shows you the amount of investment that's gone into the mining sector. The bit marked in the red bubble, that shows you the increase in the slope of the curve for investment in the mining sector. That goes steeply up. A few years back, just when India's demand was starting to pick up, the investments in the mining sector started to rise. However, production does not seem to have taken off with the same trajectory, thus implying that the productivity of investment in the mining sector is probably suffering. Right, I think I should move on because I have really no time left with them. So I'll just 2 slides more and I'll wrap up. Now, we often sort of talk about the limits to growth, the limits to growth argument of resources. I think it's important to understand, and I think you said that brilliantly. When you were talking, I'm talking to you, Mr. Vatmeda, when you sort of spoke about the 4 A's. Now, when you're trying to get to resources, there are certain costs. The costs of exploring and finding them, and building the mines to get them out, and then the cost of transporting them to the locations of demand, and of course there's the cost of the environment as well. Now, we've sort of heard about all of those in the various presentations that we've had, but as India starts to look at finding solutions, policy solutions to this issue that I just outlined, that demand has grown but supply has not responded, it will have to take into account these costs. The costs of finding resources, the costs of ensuring that they can actually be taken out of the ground, they can be processed, that they can be transported to the demand points. Now, therefore, there's a cost of investment to all of this, and that cost of investment will amongst multiple factors, will also depend on the sort of risk premium that needs to be built in, given what's happening in the resources sector. So the option of buy, build, acquire is available to India as well. So what are the lessons from China? One, that China built its 10% growth, which is something that India, I'm sure, aspires to, based upon a high investment-led environment. Of course, China is going through its rebalancing, and there are other aspects there which I'm not touching upon here. But it did that, and it sought to release all the supply bottlenecks around doing that by ensuring security of supply of raw materials through buy, build, acquire. All those options are on the table for India as well as it goes about doing it, but the one option that perhaps could be done on a priority basis because it's right there and it's perhaps more efficient is to go after its indigenous resources and unlock those. Finally, what are the things that we need to do? We need to create a policy environment which better gets us better management. So policy environment which gets better management, better technology. You're trying to change the rules of the game, and one of the outcomes of changing the rules of the game ought to be that you get better players into the system. And I think one of the issues that the sector is currently facing are governance issues, and those should be resolved first and foremost. So having building capacity, building capability. India has got some fantastic rules and regulations, but building the capacity and the capability to put those into action, that's number one, and that will take care of many of the governance issues we are seeing. Now, recognition of the principles of mining. Exploration, as I said, is a science, and I think as we formulate policy towards accessibility, and as you were saying earlier, Mr. Vatmana, it also involves understanding the science of exploration and how that takes place and how you identify resources, allowing for new entrants. FDI is 100% open in India. However, there are very few new players that are coming into the sector, understanding that. So making sure that new entrants reducing entry barriers for new entrants to come in, more streamlined coordination amongst the various players, that would be the another one. And of course, lastly, as I was saying, there's a certain cost of creating the transportation and the logistics network needed to move the resources around. Right, I think I should just stop there with them. It's a bit abrupt, but I hope that's been useful. We can always take questions. Thank you so much.